It's Monday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative MP Dehenna Davison, Scottish Labour leader Anas Sarwar, Times columnist and reaction editor Ian Martin, and New Statesman political correspondent Ailbhe Rea. Today,
he said, she said, he said, who said, unnamed sources going round in circles from advisers on advisers on advisers.
Are allegations of impropriety more than tittle-tattle?
I think for a lot of people, this is beginning to feel very strongly like one rule for them and another rule for everybody else.
How much damage can this former advisor do to Boris Johnson?
Absolutely delighted to be back. Obviously a cup of tea at the moment, but perhaps later on outside, maybe a wee pint.
Scotland and Wales take a big step out of lockdown. My guest Anas Sarwar says this.
It doesn't have to be about the Constitution. It can be about you, your family and our national recovery.
But can he avoid questions around independence? Unsurprisingly, several of today's papers splash on the ongoing row between Boris Johnson and his former chief advisor, Dominic Cummings. Let's start with the headline in the Daily Mail, War of Downing Street. Boris, and this is an alleged quote from the Prime Minister from last year, let the bodies pile high in their thousands. This is an unnamed person who said they heard Boris Johnson say it over discussions about avoiding another lockdown. Number 10 have said it's just another lie. Let's take a look at The Times and their headline, which is Cummings, Dominic Cummings, still in frame as lockdown leaks rat. And this is about the ongoing inquiry by the Cabinet Office Secretary into who leaked details of a second lockdown. And The Telegraph follows a similar theme. Cummings warned he isn't in clear over chatty rat leak, chatty rat being the term that was reportedly used. Now, the government, of course, would much rather be talking about vaccination news. More than half of the UK population has now received at least a first dose of vaccine against COVID-19, and the advert that they're putting out encouraging people in England, 44-year-olds now, to go and get their vaccination. So my opening question to all of you to briefly respond is, will the briefing war matter when the vaccination programme is continuing apace and the UK is emerging from the pandemic? Ian?
It's very difficult to know. I mean, if you're playing Westminster scandal bingo and you hear the phrase tittle-tattle used by a cabinet minister sent out to defend a prime minister in trouble, you know they really think that it's serious. They're trying to indicate that we should all that this is merely gossip when it's clearly much more serious than that. I think, I mean, on the question of the leaks and everything related to COVID, it's perfectly possible that voters will longer term take the view that government was chaotic at various stages of the crisis and it was a global pandemic, and give them a pass on that because of vaccination. I think the more particular sort of tightly defined legal problem they have on the question of the flat and the renovation of the flat, and whether or not political donations were treated as political donations on the way in terms of tax purposes and law, and then went to the Prime Minister to do up the residence. Well, we're now assured that the Prime Minister then signed a cheque himself to pay that in full. But I think it's on that where Number 10 are going to be in real trouble with. I don't think it's impossible to imagine a police inquiry if there is a complaint at some point and the Electoral Commission want questions answered. A lot of the other stuff I think can be dismissed as he said, she said, and it's very confusing. But on the flat, I think they have a big problem.
OK, and we are going to talk about this, unsurprisingly, in a little more detail. Ailbhe, just stepping back again, what will the government and the Prime Minister be judged on more, do you think? The issues that Ian has just outlined or the ongoing vaccination programme?
Good question. I think that Probably the vaccination programme is front and centre of everyone's minds. Basically, every member of the public will be encountering the success of the vaccination programme. If they haven't already, they will soon. But I think that Ian is entirely right that amid all the noise about lots of he said, she said, all that, I think that there is a real question about whether Boris Johnson and the Conservatives broke electoral law in this refurbishment of the Downing Street flat. And I think that really then whether the public is paying attention at the moment or not, the possibility that that will involve a police inquiry that could be really, really serious will have cut through above and beyond anything to do with vaccines.
Anas?
Look, I think the vaccine is fundamentally important because that's what's going to get us out of the crisis. So naturally, people are going to concentrate largely in terms of everyday people concentrate on the vaccine. But I think where this comes into context is people judging whether they think the government had their eye on the ball through the actual pandemic itself or the height of the pandemic. And then it's about government focus. So as people start to think about life after COVID-19 and all the aftermath of COVID-19 about the recovery, I think people will start judging whether, is this a government that's got its eye on the ball in the recovery? Is it a government that's thinking about our jobs and the economy? Is it a government that's thinking about the catch-up that we need around our NHS and our education system? And if they think the government's got its eye off the ball and is encountered in turmoil rather than on the people's priority, I think that's when it might start getting more of a cut through with the everyday public.
Right, well, picking up on that, it's distracting. It must be, Dehenna. Government taking its eye off the ball, never mind dismissing allegations that many people would think are extremely important as tittle-tattle.
Well, earlier, Joe, from one of the headlines, you mentioned either a war or a battle. And I think at the moment, the only war that matters is the war against COVID and really fighting this pandemic to get our country through this really difficult crisis. That's why the vaccination programme is so important, and it has been a very successful programme. You know, we see the figures now, over 50% of the population vaccinated, which is an incredible achievement from this government. And I think as we move forward, it's right that the government will be fully focused on the economic recovery, but also recovery through education, through our health.
But Dehenna, they can't be fully focused on it, can they? If there are these numerous inquiries ongoing into all sorts of claims and counterclaims.
Well, you know, there are times for inquiries and, you know, I'm sure they will be a slight distraction, but the absolute focus of the Conservative Party, of the government, and certainly of we backbenchers, are the things that our constituents care about. And I have not had a single email about any of the Dominic Cummings allegations, nor about the flat refurbishment. People are writing to me about things that are affecting them day to day on the ground, things about jobs, things about making sure they're going to be as well off, if not better off, once COVID is behind us. So they're the things that I and this government are focusing on.
BBC's Deputy Political Editor, Vicky Young, is here with me in the studio. There are lots of different strands to this story that is getting bigger, it seems, at the moment by the day. But let's put aside the personal drama between Boris Johnson and his former chief advisor, just for the moment, Dominic Cummings, because there are some specific questions that do need answering. Much of the controversy is over the timing of the second lockdown last year and who leaked it. And the other is that Simon Case, the most senior civil servant, is expected to be asked about this later today. What could we find out?
Yeah, because this is about a leak inquiry. So cast your minds back to October, November last year. All sorts of speculation about whether Boris Johnson was going to go for another lockdown. Now, all the rumours at the time were that he was very reluctant to do this. He was weighing up, as ever, the economic damage with, of course, trying to control the pandemic. You know, this has been a pattern throughout all of this. But the decision was made on a Friday evening, and then that decision was leaked. So the question is, who did that? Now, there was an inquiry into that. Now, Simon Case, the most senior civil servant, will have been involved in all of that. Now, Dominic Cummings, of course, based on his blog from Friday, says that it wasn't him. He says that he was exonerated. That will be a question for Simon Case. Has he been exonerated? And then the dispute here is that Dominic Cummings says it was all pointing to somebody who worked for Michael Gove, and he happened to be best friends with Carrie Simons, the Prime Minister's fiancée. And so the question is, did the Prime Minister interfere in any way with this independent inquiry? Did he actually say to Simon Case, look, could you just go easy here? Can we stop this inquiry? We don't have any evidence that he did that. what Dominic Cummings is saying is that the Prime Minister thought about doing that.
Right, and Simon Case, as you say, will be questioned by MPs later today. Let's turn to the refurbishment of the Prime Minister's flat. It's actually in number 11 Downing Street, or over number 11. We can show you here the inside of that flat at the time when Samantha Cameron, the Camerons, were living there. Here she is, entertaining Michelle Obama, former First Lady. And as you can see, it had recently been refurbished, a brand new kitchen and furnishings to boot. Now, once again, let's bring it to today. And Boris Johnson, what do we know about the refurbishment?
We don't know an awful lot, but again, there will be evidence of bills paid and, you know, a paper trail. So again, Simon Case, the Cabinet Secretary, you know, he will be asked about this. How much did he know about what was going on? Now, what happens is that when a Prime Minister comes in, they are allowed to spend money on refurbishment, £30,000 a year. Now, in some cases, Prime Ministers have topped that up with their own money. So the question here is who paid for it. Downing Street said on Friday the Prime Minister paid for the wider refurbishment. The question is, did somebody else originally pay for it? Did the Prime Minister ask Conservative donors, for example, to pay for it? Did the Conservative Party pay for it? And the other question, of course, why does any of this matter? Some people will be thinking, well, I'm glad that the taxpayer's not paying for it. I'd rather a Tory donor did it. It's all about transparency. We have rules. There's the Electoral Commission. You have to declare donations to the Electoral Commission. MPs have a register of interest where they have to put in, because we, the taxpayer, and we, the public, have to know if ministers or prime ministers are being given money or gifts by people, because we have to know that there is no conflict of interest. So really, I think this is going to come down to the transparency. But again, Simon Case should be able to answer some of these questions.
Stay with us, Vicky. We're listening to that, Anna Sarwar. Simon Case, the senior civil servant, is going to be asked about it. The Electoral Commission is looking into this issue about the payment for the refurbishment. And Number 10 has said that Boris Johnson has paid for it himself. What more do you want to happen?
Look, I think we do need transparency, but I think there's a wider point here, which is around, on all of these questions, I think people watching it just think, this is politicians in the round, the political bubble, at it, wasting public money while we're struggling to get ourselves through this pandemic and struggling to get back into work. And that's why I think it connects to the first question around what do people out there really take from it all. And I think the challenge will be for the government, but actually for wider politics as well, is if it looks like when we're all really, really struggling with our work, our employment, putting food on the table, you know, the bubble or the politics or the government is at it, worried about themselves. That's when I think it starts getting difficult for government. And I think actually more than for government, I think it then puts people to question wider democracy and wider parliamentary democracy, which is bad for all of us.
Right. Well, I mean,
that's why the expenses scandal was actually so bad in terms of breaching public trust. And that, if it gets to that point, I think that's where it becomes more of a bigger issue for the political class.
I mean, Dominic Cummings alleges that the Prime Minister planned to have donors secretly pay for the work. And he said it was unethical, foolish and possibly illegal. If it's a case of knowing what happened before Boris Johnson did pay for the refurbishment, isn't that important to be completely open and transparent?
Well, I think transparency is incredibly important. And I understand that we are going to get that transparency. As you've said, Simon Case will be answering questions later. And my understanding is that when the next ministerial sort of statement of interest will be published, that this will be published in full as well. So that transparency is there. But this government has been so transparent right throughout this pandemic, you know, publishing details of the contracts, holding daily press conferences to give the latest update and allowing journalists into those press conferences to ask questions, whilst also allowing the public in there to ask questions. So if it's a matter of transparency, I think this government has actually gone above and beyond at a time when so much of ministers' time and the Prime Minister's time has been devoted to fighting this pandemic.
Right. I mean, holding a press conference, we would perhaps expect from a Prime Minister and a government during a pandemic. Coming clean exactly about the train of events in terms of who and how the bill was paid for in the refurbishment of the Downing Street flat is another thing, isn't it, Dehenna?
Well, as someone who wasn't involved in those discussions, I think it's right that Mr. Case answers those questions this afternoon, but also that when the ministerial statements are published with any sort of declarations of interest there, that it's right that they're assessed then. But at the moment, once again, kind of going back to my previous answer and slightly agreeing there with Anas as well, you know, people out there, people in my constituency, when I'm out there door knocking or when I'm talking to them on the phone, this isn't being raised because people are more interested in how we'll get through this pandemic, making sure their jobs are secure, making sure their children are going to get their catch up in education. That's what people in my constituency and right there around the country are concerned about. And it's frustrating once again to see the Westminster bubble getting so obsessed with something that people out there just don't really care about.
Anis, is that the point you were trying to make?
No, kind of. But the point I'm trying to make is if the public see that our government and our politicians are worried about their own bills and their own refurbishments and their own issues, whereas I'm trying to struggle to even put food on the table for my family, that's where I think the disconnect comes from. And I think that's where the trouble comes for the government, is that disconnect, similar to the package you had from Keir earlier on, one rule for them, one rule for us, is they're living a different life, completely separated from our struggles every single day. I need my government focused on my struggles. That's what people out there will be thinking.
Right, well, Diana, answer that particular point.
Well, the government is focused on those struggles, and that's why we've put in place this unprecedented level of economic support to help protect people's jobs, to save people's jobs, to create new jobs, but also to support businesses through this unprecedented pandemic. You know, the government is very much focused on people's struggles and on recovery, and I think implying anything else is absolute poppycock.
Right, well, except, I mean, what would your constituents make of the fact that the Prime Minister is spending £60,000 on doing up his flat, on replacing some of the things that are done by John Lewis?
Well, you're asking me kind of what my constituents think when not a single one of my constituents has actually contacted me about this. Not a single constituent has called my office, emailed me. Why? Because I don't think they care what sort of wallpaper's on the walls of number 10 Downing Street. What they care about is what the government is putting in place to support them through this pandemic, to get them through this really difficult time and ensure the country bounces back.
Right, Ian, Diana's constituents don't care about what sort of wallpaper is on the Downing Street flat.
The problem the government has here is that this is going to last for quite a long time. This is going to be quite corrosive. The government is almost certainly going to be forced into holding a public inquiry on the pandemic issues, and it's, I think, another 30 days until Dominic Cummings gives evidence and seems to have a lot of paperwork and more. And it's just baffling, really, and baffling a lot of people at Westminster is Boris Johnson surely knows Dominic Cummings really well. He knows how dangerous he can be, how ruthlessly effective he is as a political operator, and having let him go as his sort of political guru and main person in number 10, he had to be very careful around Cummings, and launching an attack in the way that he did last week has preempted really all-out war from Dominic Cummings, and that is going to sustain, I think, month after month. So people might say that they don't care that much now, and people have a lot on their plate, a lot on their mind at the moment. But what Labour will hope is that it just sort of corrodes the Tories' reputation. Labour's in a problem at the moment, of course, because this isn't what voters are really particularly interested. But politics, just like it did in the 90s, sometimes it changes. Sometimes politics is about one thing for a year or two, and then people think that's done. And it became about sleaze in the mid-1990s, even though the economy was suddenly sort of recovering really rather quite well. And Labour managed to frame it very much as one rule for them and one rule for another, and a question of sleaze and honesty. And Labour will be trying to do that again in the next 18 months.
Alva?
Well, I think the really important thing to emphasise is that, I mean, Diana and Anas have been talking about transparency. The problem is that I think viewers need to be reminded of is that we haven't had transparency from the government on this, and those mechanisms should already be in place. We have a register on which MPs and ministers and the Prime Minister declare any donations, any business interests that they have, so the public can see them. That has been massively delayed in the context of this Downing Street refurbishment. We're meant to get it every 6 months. It's been massively delayed. We're not able to see. Boris Johnson says that he has now footed the bill for that refurbishment, but we're not able to see who footed the bill initially. If it was footed by a donor, there is a real question as to whether that broke electoral law. This idea that the government has been transparent because it's been holding press conferences when it hasn't met its obligations and its commitments around transparency of interests is really, really important. And I think in terms of what people at home care about, I think I accept that there's a lot of noise around this. There's so many strands, as you said earlier. It's difficult, I think, for people following who aren't that interested in politics to know what matters and what doesn't. But I think that people do understand that if Boris Johnson is being given a gift of £58,000 from someone, we don't know who, and it isn't declared, that is a big issue, that we need to know who's giving politicians money. And it's just as simple as that. And I think that it's not just the question of, the fact that John Lewis, refurbishments weren't good enough and they wanted an upgrade. I think it's the real question of who's giving politicians money. Are they being entirely transparent? That really does matter to people,
yes,
in terms of the decisions being made about their lives.
And those questions will be asked this afternoon, no doubt. Let's pick up on what Ian was saying, Vicky, talking about the relationship, the breakdown in the relationship, the personal tension between Boris Johnson and his former senior advisor, Dominic Cummings. Do you think there are worries in Downing Street about what else Dominic Cummings could say? As Ian was saying, in the upcoming inquiries, we're going to see some pictures of Dominic Cummings leaving Downing Street with some flash photography, just to warn viewers coming up.
Yeah, there will be absolutely concern. And partly, looking back at that blog from Friday, what was striking is that on parts of it, Dominic Cummings seems to be quoting verbatim of what the Prime Minister has said. He puts it in speech marks. He has in brackets pause, suggests he might have recorded things as well. The problem Boris Johnson has here is that your closest advisor and your confidant, he's turned on him. And of course, he will know, Dominic Cummings, a lot of things. The point about being Prime Minister or a minister is you make decisions. There's a whole process. Someone who's been at the heart of government like that will have seen the outbursts, the anger, how these decisions were eventually made, warts and all. And I think that's the problem. Now that Dominic Cummings has decided he's going to speak out, and I don't think many people thought he was ever going to go quietly. And Tory MPs, over the last couple of years, so many of them have said to me, this is not going to end well. They were very, very queasy about Dominic Cummings coming into the heart of government, partly because, as one said to me, Dominic Cummings has no loyalty to the Tory party or the Prime Minister. And so I think that is the problem. That's what they fear might be coming. And they don't know what else he's got. There has to be, though, a question too about Dominic Cummings, I suppose. Some people will be looking at this and going, he shouldn't be doing this. Actually, he's been at the heart of government. Advisors shouldn't then tell all. That's not what they're there to do. He should have some loyalty to Boris Johnson. And of course, most people watching this at home will know Dominic Cummings because of what he did during the pandemic, that trip, of course, up to Durham. And so there are many Tory MPs saying, well, he hasn't got any credibility. He is disgruntled. But there's certainly been a huge breakdown. It was there for a few months, simmering away, that tension. And reading that blog, so much of it is about Carrie Simons, the Prime Minister's fiancée. She is at the heart of a lot of this. And it was, as ever, it's a very old thing that happens. It's about who's got the ear of the Prime Minister. And of course, his fiancée does have an influence. The difference is, of course, she used to work for the Conservative Party. She is a Conservative. She has lots of friends in the media and ministers who are friends. And so she is much more involved in all of that than many other spouses would have been.
How worried are you, Dehenna, that this could just go on and on for months? And about what Dominic Cummings could say?
Well, as I understand it, Mr Cummings will be appearing in front of the House of Commons committee later, I think towards the end of May. So that'll be an opportunity for MPs to quiz him on whatever events took place, and also an opportunity once again for the Westminster bubble to obsess over Mr Cummings' actions. I think the only thing that I would personally thank Mr Cummings for is putting Bonard Castle firmly on the map, because we have been having a fantastic tourism boom and Bonard Castle is right in the heart of my constituency.
Well, that is one way of looking at it, Dehenna. They're becoming the tourist officer there for Bonard Castle. But were you queasy, like some of your colleagues in the Conservative Party, about Dominic Cummings entering Parliament at all? Entering government, I should say, at all?
It's kind of hard for me to say, to be honest, Joe, because I think at the time when he kind of entered government, it was either just before my time or pretty much when I got elected. So I was kind of more focused on getting to know the job, learning the job and getting everything set up in my constituency. So it's a difficult one for me to answer.
All right, I'm just going to interject because we can hear from Boris Johnson himself, who is on a visit and was asked about giving more details how the flat was paid for.
If there's anything to be said about that, any declaration to be made, that will of course be made in due course. And I'm finding that actually what people here in North Wales, here in Wrexham, want us to concentrate on is making sure we get on with the vaccine rollout. And I'm here not far from Wockhart, which is the the epicenter in many ways of this country's vaccine success. It's produced tens of millions of vaccines and it is enabling us to really help to bring down the levels of the pandemic and gradually to unlock the country.
That was Boris Johnson. Vicky, thank you very much for joining us. We're going to move on because it's a big day of reopening around the UK, in Wales and in Scotland. Shops, gyms, pubs and restaurants reopen in Scotland, and people can meet outdoors now in pubs, cafes and restaurants in Wales, open to customers, and up to 6 people from 6 households will be able to meet with social distancing. Let's talk to the BBC Scotland correspondent, Alexandra Mackenzie. I think she is close to a pub in East Renfrewshire. Can you hear me there? Yeah. There she's inside.
Yes,
hello,
I
Alexandra.
can hear you.
Tell her, yes, she couldn't get closer. You could have a pub.
I am inside. It is quite noisy. It's getting quite busy, but yes, I can just about hear you. Now, there's a lot happening in Scotland today, and one of the things is that hospitality is starting to open up. It's not quite normal. You can come inside, but you can only come inside for food. So I'm sitting at a bar for the first time in months. They poured a pint here at 11 o'clock for the first time since October. But if you want to have alcohol, you can eat inside, but you can't have alcohol inside. So if you want to have a drink, you're going to have to do that outside. But there are quite a few people sitting out in the cold in the beer garden enjoying a pint. Now, there are some restrictions. There's 1 metre distancing, which the hospitality industry has said could be quite challenging. As people have been coming in the door, they've been giving their contact details, and there's a new app in Scotland called Check-in Scotland that you can download onto your phone, and that should make it a bit easier. We can meet in slightly larger groups. If you're outside, you can meet in groups of up to 6 people, and that's from up to 6 households. But if you're inside in a public place, you can also meet in groups of 6, but that's only from 2 households. And until at least the 17th of May, we won't be allowed to meet within other people within our homes. Retail is another thing that has opened up today if you want to hit the shops and you're fed up with online shopping. Also, if you want to go to the gym, there's no gym classes at the moment, but for individual exercise, and also swimming has opened up for individual exercise as well. And travel restrictions, all travel restrictions within Scotland have gone, and you can travel from Scotland to the rest of the UK. And the tourist industry has also started to open up. You can stay in hotels and B&Bs, but you can't go and stay overnight with friends or family just yet.
All right, Alexandra, thank you very much. From inside the pub there in East Renfrewshire. Anas, what are you looking forward to doing?
Well, I was actually out this morning supporting the retail, buying a couple of teddy bears for my youngest, actually. Sadly, I don't drink, and also in the midst of Ramadan, so I couldn't go to any bars or enjoy any of the hospitality. But the most significant thing I'm looking forward to is getting a chance to go and hug my granny, to be honest. It's been a long time.
Oh, well, of course, you and many others, no doubt. Well, you can look forward to doing that very soon. Let's talk about the elections. Big elections coming up on May the 6th. And you and the Labour Party are saying that all the focus should be on the recovery from the pandemic rather than the issue of independence. Are you just trying to duck a difficult question?
No, I answer the question every single day, and I'm happy to answer the question again today. I don't support independence. I don't support a referendum. But the point I'm making in this election campaign is COVID didn't choose between yes, no, leave and remain. The aftermath is not going to choose between yes, no, leave and remain. And what I'm not willing to do is only present a policy programme that's for the half of the country that agrees with me on the Constitution. I want us to have a recovery that works for everyone, right across the country, and not go back to those old divides.
Right, but you could end up talking to no one at all, because independence is the central question, isn't it, at this election, because the SNP is seeking a mandate to go for a second independence referendum.
Yeah, so it's a central question for the SNP. It's conversely the central question for the Tories. It's, of course, the central question for the political bubble, but I actually don't think it's a central question for the public. And so actually, I think the SNP and the Tories are disconnected from the public in terms of what they care about every single day right now. And I think we've got the right message. I think people care about not the date of a referendum. I think they care about, we've talked about it today, keeping their loved ones safe, getting access to the vaccine, if and when they'll have a job to go back to, the education system, catching up on our NHS. So that's not me avoiding the question. I'm happy to answer the constitutional question to say we don't support independence, we don't support a referendum. But I want to change the way we do our politics in Scotland. I want us to focus for a change on what unites us as a country, not what divides us, so we can build a country that works for everyone.
Right, but you say it's the central question for the SNP, but let's have a look at this from Ipsos Mori. Which issues will help voters decide which party to vote for? And it looks like Scottish independence and devolution is the number one issue for voters. In fact, it's gone up by 5 points to 49%. So you're in the wrong ballpark here.
No, actually, no, Joe, because there's another poll yesterday done by Survation which talked about what are the priorities that matter to you. What that poll asks is what are the issues that you think about when you're going to choose how you vote, not what your direct priorities are. So I'm not denying for a second that there are a lot of people across Scotland who are only going to vote for a political party that shares its political view in the Constitution. I understand that. I understand the divisions we've had over the last 10 years. But what I'm saying to people is that doesn't need to be your only choice. Coming through a pandemic, the priorities right now has to be jobs in the economy, has to be the NHS, has to be getting our education system back to being the best in the world again. And if you want to choose something different, if you don't want to go back to those old arguments, only Labour's offering you an alternative.
Right. I mean, you talk about it in those terms, but if we go back to the 2019 general election, Labour suffered their worst defeat, as you know, and partly it was constructive ambiguity, which was the phrase critics used, in the party's approach to Brexit. Don't you risk making that same mistake when it comes to your approach on independence, saying that the economy is going to matter more? Because as we saw there in the 2019 general election, Brexit mattered a lot.
So look, I'm not being ambiguous about this. I'm saying directly and unequivocally, I don't support independence. I don't support a referendum. I don't think that should be the focus of our next parliament. But what I'm not willing to do is only talk to the half of the country that agrees with me on the Constitution. I want to offer something different to people across the country.
Ian?
Yeah, well, Anna Sarwar's made a very deliberate strategic choice. Find out in 10 days' time whether it works, to not, as you described, Joe, to not really talk about independence. And the reason it's deliberate is that it's about trying to, the voters he's trying to win over and convert are what you might term soft nationalists, people who maybe used to vote Labour, then voted for the SNP, and he needs to try and get a hearing again from those people. And those voters, the opinion polls and the focus groups that are being done will show, they don't really want to hear a slanging match between unionists and nationalists. So he's positioning himself theoretically quite cleverly, but I think the problem, and it's difficult to know, is that you might get a hearing from those people, but then they still vote SNP in the end, and it may end up leaving him with very little decisive and clear to say about the union, particularly when the SNP are under quite a bit of pressure at the moment on questions like whether or not there'll be a hard border if there is independence.
Alba, do you think Labour's strategy will work?
Yeah, I think you've outlined not just in this election, but the broader electoral tightrope that Scottish Labour walks on this, where they aren't in favour of independence, but they're the third party in Scotland and, have lost a lot of support to the SNP in the past few decades. And so really what they're trying to do is to make a pro-union case, but ultimately to dial the whole issue down the agenda. In a sense, coronavirus has been helpful for them in terms of this approach, because they can, at least in this election, do what you've heard Anna Sarwar say, that make the case that not now for a referendum. But I think it's a bit more difficult in the longer term for them to strike that balance, because there are discussions within Scottish Labour that are very alive. Some people in favour of independence, but an even bigger chunk who are open to the idea of holding that referendum, who, internally they're referred to as pro-choice on a referendum issue. They're not in favour of independence, but they want to have that discussion. And I think that, as you said, there has been a little bit of an issue for Scottish Labour in the recent past of seeming to have a position of constructive ambiguity. And that's what Anna Sarwar is very deliberately not doing. He's still saying, we're not in favour of independence, we don't want another referendum, but it's a tricky balance to strike. And then on that point about the fact that voters do seem, according to most polls, to care most about independence, I think that demonstrates the most immediate challenge for Scottish Labour, because even though I think, Anna Sarwar was widely praised for his performance in the recent leaders' debates in Scotland, and he's made a positive impression so far. The thing we know about voters in Scotland is that independence, either way, is the issue that motivates them. So even if people like Anas's ideas, people who are either strongly in favour of independence or actually strongly opposed are most likely to be the people who turn out on the day to vote. And they're not going to be voting Scottish Labour, they're going to be voting SNP and Conservative.
Anas?
Well, look, what I'd say, look, I accept that the Labour Party's got a huge challenge. And look, when I took over the job just 8 weeks ago, we were at 14% in the opinion polls. And a poll out just yesterday had us from 14% to 22%. So that's an 8% increase in just 8 weeks. And of course, we still got 10 days left in this election campaign. So I understand the point people are making, but it's a longer term project. I'm not pretending that I'm some kind of superhero that's fixed all the problems in the Scottish Labour Party, and the process of change is complete in the Labour Party, and I'm going to go from 14% in the polls to us having a Labour government in 10 days' time. I think if I came on the programme and said that to you, Joe, you would write me, phoning me afterwards to suggest I needed to have a lie down. So I completely understand that I've got to take the Labour Party on a process and a journey. But what I'm saying directly to people, and I take the point people are saying about, you know, COVID helps in terms of the current context, but actually the context beyond COVID as well is there has to come a point. Surely has to come a point, and I think this is a point actually UK-wide, not just in Scotland. There surely has to come a point where we recognise that the 10 years of division that we've had, when politicians that have presented binary choices to the public and forced people to pick a side, has meant that so many other things have fallen down the agenda, whether it be around jobs, economy, anything else. And we have failure after failure of this government in Scotland. But the challenge we have in our politics in Scotland, and this I think is the real fault line in our politics, is whenever there's a big failure in Scotland, they point and say it wouldn't have happened if we had independence, or worse still, at least we're not as bad as that lot over there, and point at the Tories. I think our politics will be better than that.
All right, we're going to leave it there because we have to move on. But just to say that we'll be speaking to other party leaders in Scotland throughout the campaign. I want to bring you this piece of breaking news. It's on the BBC website. British Iranian charity worker Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe sentenced to a year in prison after being found guilty of propaganda activities against the regime in Iran. And you can read more about that story. Now it's broken on the BBC website. I'm going to draw viewers' attention to this headline in The Times, written by our guests, Iena Davison and Greg Smith. Time for the Treasury to rediscover the free market. Viewers might be wondering, Dehenna, why it's taken a new Conservative group and party of Margaret Thatcher to remind people that the free market is still important.
Well, I think right at the heart of the Conservative Party is a belief that the free market is important. I think we're just trying to re-emphasise the point that obviously throughout the pandemic, it has been right that the government has intervened to support businesses, to support jobs. And I think any free market economist would agree that that is completely the right approach in this very unusual set of circumstances. What we're saying is, as soon as the pandemic is firmly behind us, it is time to come together as a party to really push for that free market approach. Because, you know, we understand that, you know, people on the street know better how to spend their money than the government ever will. They know better how to make their own decisions than the state ever will. We really need to have that at the heart of everything that we do as we move out of this pandemic.
Right. And you say move out of the pandemic and the end of the crisis. It could rumble on for years.
It absolutely could. So we need to keep a very close eye on things because, as we've heard the Chancellor say, we've spent an awful lot of taxpayers' money and we need to get on top of that. We need to get the deficit down and start repaying the debt again and be very kind of frugal with our public finances. And that is all kind of part of why we've set up this new group to make sure that the government is definitely on the right track as we move forward. And we're going to be presenting kind of policy ideas, tax ideas for how best we can bring the free market into what it is that the government's doing to take us forward in the best possible way, not just for the sake of politics, but for the sake of making people's lives better on the ground.
Right. Ian, it's interesting that they have to restate this as part of the Conservative Party, isn't it? And do you still think the Conservative Party is the party of the small state?
Certainly not. I think it's fundamentally changed in character, partly because of the extraordinary new coalition of voters that it built at the last election and at the election before, that it is now, it's got this fusion of voters in the north and fused with the south of England, and that's a governing coalition that can get them sort of 42 to 45%. And those voters are not, when you examine their social attitudes, they're not for a small state. And also the instincts of the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister likes spending big, he likes big infrastructure, he likes boosterism, all of that. So actually I think one of the consequences of the pandemic, when you see just how much money is being spent, and I think a lot of it did have to be spent, was that free marketeers on the Conservative side of the argument have come to realise actually, and that's why pamphlets and work like this and articles like that are important, they're actually really quite a small minority now. And I think those who believe in the power of free markets and orderly regulation and enterprise are, post-pandemic, going to have to remake those arguments just as they were sort of made in the 1970s.
Right, I mean, Albert, politically, Labour might prefer if the Tories went back to being the party of the small state, or certainly saying that they are, rather than parking their tanks on Labour's lawn.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think that Deanna's article and this new push from certain free market conservatives to put a free market agenda right front and centre of the debate does point to a kind of anxiety on the Conservative backbenches that it's not entirely clear what the Boris Johnson political project is. But I think on the Labour side, you're right, that the thing they're concerned about, they know that the economy remains their Achilles heel politically. On things like the NHS, they remain the more trusted political party. It's on the economy where they are desperately trying to build credibility and confidence. They didn't have that in the Ed Miliband era, let alone under Jeremy Corbyn. They're desperately trying to win that back. So I think it's actually a bit more complicated than that. You know, I think they don't want to just be seen as the generous party against the generous party, because they don't necessarily even just want to be seen as the generous party at all. But definitely, I think a more conventional, largesse, market split would be easier for Labour.
Right. I mean, Deanna, your constituents may disagree with you. They probably, in your area, quite like the idea of a Conservative government spending more money, even if it's taxpayers' money. That's what levelling up is. That's what that agenda is supposed to be.
Well, certainly some of the investment that we're seeing in Bishop Auckland is absolutely incredible. We've got Towns Fund money.
Right.
But it's not just about spending money, though, Jo. I mean, there are incredible things the government can do without spending money that do help in the process of levelling up. So one of the things that we're currently exploring is around procurement rules, to say if a big government contract is going to go somewhere, could we change those rules a little bit to ensure that some of the points that add up to that contract are because they're going to be investing in an area that hasn't got a great deal of investment, putting jobs somewhere that don't have a great deal of jobs. So that's not about spending money. That's just about changing the rules to make kind of the whole system more fit for purpose, to aid in levelling up, but without saying we necessarily need to do it by throwing money at things.
Ian?
Interventionist government. And I think the danger for those of us who believe in the power of free markets is that a lot of this stuff is really initially quite popular. And I think the danger is, if you look at what happened last week with football, where I happen to think it was the right decision to try and shut down this new European Super League, because it was a cartel that was being created. But if the government starts to think that it should apply this technique in absolutely every area of the economy, and look, I mean, the pandemic is an exercise in extraordinary intervention in the economy and management of people's daily lives. And my fear would be that the government has the bug, and through things like the European Super League project, it's going to interfere even more in economics.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. That's all we have time for. Thank you to all of my guests for joining us today. And just to repeat that the senior civil servant Simon Case will be questioned by MPs later on. Otherwise, I'll be back tomorrow at 12:15. Please do join me.